In this video, I'm going to show you the Application Security on Cloud plugin for urbanCode deploy. So what we're taking a look at right here, we're looking at the steps breakdown. These are all the different steps that you can run with the plugin. So the first one here, you can see we can create in Application Security presence. So this is a concept in Application Security on Cloud. What it does is it allows you to scan private web applications from outside machines. So if we have one machine that has access to a private application, say it's hosting that application, we can create a presence on that machine and run the process for the agent process for the presence on that machine, and use that ID in separate environments to run the scan on that web application. So also what we allow you to do from the plugin, we can delete presences. We can delete a specific presence just based on the ID. We can delete all presences that the current user account has access to. And speaking of the user account, you'll notice that you log in with the key ID and key secret, which is actually created in AppScan on Cloud. So I won't be going over that in the demo, but that's just something to note. Also, we can both start and stop presences. So when you go and start a presence, actually what it does is it uses the ID to download the script to actually kick off a new process on the agent machine. So then it's going to run that process. And then similarly, when you stop the presence, it's going to kill that process. All right, and then the last thing we can do is that we can, probably most importantly, run scans. So you can run both mobile scans of Android applications or iOS applications. You can also run dynamic scans, as I explained in a bit, of either private or public web applications. And we can run static scans of, for instance, Java projects. We can pull down the Java class files and we can scan them with the plugin and Application Security on Cloud. So what I'm going to show you in the demo is we're going to go through the create presence, delete presence, start presence, start dynamic scan, and start static scan. So what's going to happen in the demo, I have two different agents that I created, which they're both on the same network, but for demonstration purposes, we're going to pretend that they're not on the same network. So we have a demo application provided by the application security team called Altoro Mutual, and this is public, but if it were private, I'm going to treat it basically as if it were a private website. So we're going to have, on the first agent, we're going to create a new presence, and we're going to start that presence on the agent. And then on the second agent, we're going to use the presence ID, which is output from the create presence command, to run a scan on that private web application. So, and then after we finish up with that, we'll also show running that same scan with a scan configuration file, which I briefly explained. You'll notice in the dynamic analyzer step, we have this scan or scan template file. So you can either specify a scan file, and this is actually just a full scan that you've run before with reports and everything. And then this scan file is just the scan T file is the template file, which is actually just used for configuration settings. So that's what we're going to use in our scan. And then lastly, we'll just run a static scan. The application security team provided a sample Java application called Simple IoT Java, and we're going to pull down those class files and we're going to scan them using urbanCode deploy. So now we're in the urbanCode deploy server, and what I'm looking at here is I'm looking at my agent resources. So for this demonstration, I've gone ahead and created two different resources, one of them being an agent pull and one of them being just a single agent. So as I explained in the introduction here, what we're going to do is we're going to create a presence on one agent, and we're going to use that presence ID on another agent to actually run the scan. So for the demonstration, this ASOC demo agent here, this is going to be our local agent. So this is going to be the machine that has access to the private web application. So we're going to tag this here as local. And then this agent pool is going to be all of our dev agents. So all the agents that operate in our dev environment, they're going to exist under this pool. And for the demo, I've just created two of them. We have, this is the local agent that I just explained, and then we have actually a completely separate machine. So when the scan process runs from urbanCode deploy, the UCD server is actually going to pick from this agent pool and choose which one is available to run the scan. So since we're using the presence and we have the private web application only accessible to this first demo agent, it's not going to matter if the second agent actually has access to that presence. So it can run the scan on the private website regardless. So, and then each of these agents are going to exist under this resource that I've created in the resource tree. So this AppScan on Cloud Dev Presence resource, this is just going to hold that ID of the presence to run. So when a process runs in the inside of this agent pool, when any of these agents runs the process, they're going to reference the presence ID from the AppScan on Cloud Dev Presence resource, and they're going to be able to scan the private website that exists on the local agent machine. So what we're going to look at here in the urbanCode deploy server is our Altoro Mutual application. So I created this application with one single environment. So this is just the dev environment since we have those dev agents that I just showed you. And we'll go ahead and look through the dev environment. So we added both of the agent resources to it. So we have the agent pool, and then we have that single local agent that I mentioned before, each existing under that presence resource. So since they exist under the presence resource, everything underneath will have access to the ID that is created, the presence ID that is created on this resource. So I've created one component, the Altoro Mutual Scanner, which is going to actually execute the scan, and it's also going to create the presence. So I added it to both the agent pool and the local agent. So the process that's going to run in the local agent's environment is just going to be the one to create the presence and start the presence. The process that's going to execute in the remote agent environment is just going to be the actual scan itself. So this is going to run first, and it's going to create the presence, and then the remote agents have access to that presence ID. So just to kind of briefly explain the property hierarchy in UCD, we have properties available to each of the components by the application, the agent, the resources, the components themselves. So what I did was in the Altoro Mutual application, I define all of the web application specific properties here in the configuration. So I have the ID of the application, the password, user, URL, everything. These are all going to be referenced by the components process to run that scan. Similarly, the agent is where I created the AppScan on Cloud specific login credentials. So if we go under this agent, for example, the local agent, if we look at the properties, we have the key ID and key secret, both used to log into application security on cloud. And this makes it so that you can have different credentials per different agent environments if you need that. So, and then the last portion of the hierarchy of properties here we have is the dev presence resource. So if we go ahead and look at the actual resource itself, we'll see couple properties here. This is just to define the ID of this resource. Because what we're going to do in the component process, we're going to set this property. So we reference the resource's ID to set a new property on the resource. So that being this AppScan on Cloud presence ID. So after we go run on the local agent to create the presence, the step that does that is going to output the presence ID that it creates, and we're going to use that to set this property on their resource. And it will make a little bit more sense after I go through running the actual process. Now we're looking at the Altoro Mutual Scanner, which I just showed you in the application environment. So I added it to that dev environment under each of the resources. So we'll take a look at the processes that I created in the Altoro Mutual Scanner. So these are going to use steps from the Application Security on Cloud plugin. The first one we'll look at is the one that's going to run in the local agents environment. So this is going to be to create the presence or start the presence. So we'll look at the create presence step first. What this is going to do, this is going to use that agent property, the key ID that I showed you before. It's going to use that to log in, and it's also the key secret. This is a redacted value, so you can't actually see it, but it's just this with the key secret property referenced. So at runtime, these values are going to be resolved to their correct property value. And then here, this checkbox here allows you to, after you create the presence, to start the presence. So if you, for whatever reason, you didn't want to start the presence, you wanted to start it later maybe, you could uncheck that. But for my demonstration, I'm going to be starting the presence. So it's going to create a new presence and start it. And also what this does, if you look at the description, it's going to output a property called presence ID. So after the presence is created, it outputs the presence ID, and then subsequent steps such as this set resource property can reference it by the step name, which is create ASOC presence. So if we look at this set resource property, you may have briefly noticed that in the dev presence resource that I showed you earlier, we have this resource ID property. So this is going to reference that resource's ID so that I can create a new property inside of it. So after the presence is created, then we're going to create this ASOC presence ID property on the dev presence resource. And the value is going to be referenced from the step name that I mentioned before, create ASOC presence ID. Okay. There's two different paths that this step can take, or that this process can take that I designed. So the differentiation is going to be between the precondition here. So if we take a look, these preconditions are written in JavaScript, and we have access to a properties variable, which has all of the different properties that are available to this component. So if we look here, what I'm doing is I'm checking if the presence ID is either undefined or it's empty. So what this would mean was that I haven't already gone through and created a new presence. So if I haven't already gone through and created a new presence, I want this step to run. So this is going to run and create a new presence. It's going to go down here and set the resource property, which has the same precondition. Otherwise, if the presence ID property is already set on our dev presence resource, this precondition is going to be met, which is going to be the property is not undefined or it is not empty. So then it's going to go through and actually download that the presence's file. It's going to unzip it, and it's going to run the start presence script on the agent that executes this. So it's also the other process that we're going to run is going to be run in the remote environment. And this is the run app scan application security on cloud dynamic scan. So this is just one single step here, but it has a lot of properties, so we'll take a look at it. These are the application specific properties, so that web application for the property has the property application ID, which is going to be referenced here. And this is the ID in application security on cloud itself. So if we look at application security on cloud, and I'll need to log in here. We have these different applications. I have this El Toro Mutual application, and I can click and see the ID in the URL up here. So this is the ID that I'm going to use to run the scan. So by using that ID, all of the scan results are going to be saved in that application and application security on cloud. So similarly, we'll use the agent's key ID and key secret to log into application security on cloud. And then the other specific application properties are the URL, the user. This is going to be if your website requires some login, you can use the username and password. And then we also allow you to be able to specify a third credential. And then the other value that we're going to specify here is this presence ID. So this is going to be pulled from the resource. And since we added this component to that dev presence resource, it's going to have access to this presence ID after the agent that runs locally sets it. So it will run and have access to that private website. So the other important properties that we have in the dynamic analyzer step are the scan type. So this determines basically how comprehensive your scan is going to be. So we have two different values. You have the staging and production. So the staging scan type is mainly meant for a more comprehensive scan before you actually deploy the website, while the production site scan is done on a live site. It's going to be a little less comprehensive. So we're going to run that to make it a little quicker. And then you can also specify the scan configuration file, which I'm going to do after this demonstration. I'm going to run with a scan file instead. But for here, we're not going to specify anything. This failure count threshold, failure condition threshold, this determines exactly how many of the different types of failures can occur after we run the scan. So determines how many high-level failures, how many medium, low, or informational level. So this is the default value it's set to. So this means that if any more than 0 high issues occur, the step will fail. If any more than 5 medium, 10 low, 20 informational, the step will fail. And this can be changed as well to fit your needs. And then we have another property here for original scan ID. So this allows you to run a rescan. So if we go through and run this scan, we can use the ID that's output to run it again. If you need to do that, basically for all the configuration will be set up already for you. And then we have also the this checkbox to enable email notifications. So what this does is after the scan completes, it's going to send an email to the user who actually executed it. And then the test policy, this is another field that kind of determines the comprehensiveness of the scan. So we have 3 different levels, and these are defined in application security on cloud, not just urbanCode, but urbanCode uses them. So we have the comprehensive, the most comprehensive scan, the application only, and then the vital few. And you can read the description if you need to determine which type of scan you want to run. And those are all of the processes that we're going to run in this little demo. So kind of the last piece of the puzzle here in urbanCode is the application processes. And they're going to determine which component processes run. So the first thing I'm going to run is this cleanup presences application process. So if we take a look at this, I didn't show you the full extent of the delete AppScan on Cloud presence component process, but basically what it's going to do is it's going to just delete that presence that we've created. And the way I've set it, I've checked a box to delete all presences associated with the user account. So when I go ahead and run this, let's go back and run it. So we'll go here and clean up presences. And this is just my design choice. You could do it differently. So I have it kind of compartmentalized so I can explain it a little bit better in a demo. But if you wanted to create the presence, run the scan, and then delete the presence every time, you could handle that in the application process. So you essentially have one process for run dynamic scan that would create the presence on the local agent, run the scan on either the remote or the local agent, and then delete the presence after it's done. But now I'm just going to run this cleanup presences command application process to delete my presences, just to start off with a clean slate here. Okay, so we've deleted all of our presences, and I also added the step to remove that resource property that I showed you before. So now if we take a look at the dev presence resource, now this property is actually empty. So when I go through and run the step to either create or start a presence, it's going to end up creating a presence. And I'll show you an application security on cloud as well. If we go in and look at all of our different presences, they're all gone now. So I've started off with a clean slate here. So now that we've cleaned up all of our presences, well, all the presences that I created while testing this, we're going to actually execute the process to run the dynamic scan. So what this is going to do, I briefly showed you before, it's going to create the presence and then it's going to run the scan. So let's just go through and run it. So we'll run dynamic scan. It's not going to use any files or anything. And it's kind of a differentiation between the different component process types. So as I'll show you before, when we run the scan with a file, it's going to actually ask for a version because that's a deployment type component process rather than just an operational type. So when I run this scan, it's going to run our operational type dynamic scan component process. So first it'll go through and create the presence. And you can open up the log and look at actually what it's doing. So it created the new presence and it's downloading all of the files from it. The reason it's doing that is because I checked the box for start presence. So it's going to download it, extract it, and find that that start presence script here and execute it on the agent that runs this process. So we'll actually have a presence process running on our agent machine. And we'll just wait for it to finish here. Okay, so we've successfully created and started the presence on the machine. And again, it set that resource property so that the component running down here can actually use the presence ID. So you'll notice when the create AppScan on Cloud, application security on cloud presence step ran, it actually output this presence ID property. And this is referenced by the set resource property. And if we take a look at the resource right now, you'll see that it has a value. So we reference this value when we go to run the scan, as we're doing right now. So if we look at the run dynamic scan application process here, we have the component process running and the step for start dynamic analyzer application security on cloud scan. And also you'll notice that I was notified that the scan was started because I checked that email notification box in the step configuration. So we can see what's going on here. The scan already started. I was obviously notified by it. So now we just have to sit here and wait. And you'll notice that this is going to be a pretty fast scan because it's a demo application provided specifically for running demos. So it's going to be pretty quick by the application security team. So we'll just wait until the scan completes. Okay, and it completed already. So after the scan runs, it downloads the report PDF, and it's going to look at all of the different issues that were created. So if you remember, the default issue count is we can have 0 high, 5 medium, 10 low, and 20 informational. So we actually got 10 high severity issues, 17 medium severity issues, 80 low, and 11 informational. So we failed the high, medium, and low threshold, so the scan actually fails validation. So meaning that the step will fail. So the next thing I'm going to show you now is how to run a dynamic scan from a scan configuration file or a scan template file. So let's go into the component here. It's going to be the same exact Altoro Mutual scanner component, but it's going to use a different process. And so this process here, this dynamic scan with file, is actually going to be a deployment process. So I kind of briefly explained this before between the differences between the deployment process and the operational without version process. So the deployment processes require a component version with files stored in CodeStation. So I'll show you how to set that up in the component. So if we go into the Altoro Mutual Scanner component, take a look at the configuration in here, you'll see a setup for source configuration type. So it uses a bunch of, we can specify any source configuration plugin that we have, including Git or Maven, TeamCity, TFS, or any plugin you can find on the plugin site. And these are source config plugins. So for my example, I'm just using the file system source configuration type. So what this does is you can pull files from the agent machine. So I just have a directory here in the Altoro Mutual that's going to hold my scan template file. And then actually when I go and import a new version, it's going to create a version. It's going to create a version in CodeStation that actually has that file. So you see in here I have my scan template. I also have a individual scan file. I'm not going to be using that for this demonstration. But if we take a look at inside the Altoro Mutual directory, I have this UCD prep scan T file. If I were to go ahead and I don't know, make changes to this, maybe call it, make some changes, name it as 9.5, save it, go back into UCD, run a new version import. I can give it a version tag. Maybe I'll call this one version 2. And it'll actually start pulling, using the source config type that I set up, start pulling the files into a new version for version 2. So this scan template has those changes that I made. And also another interesting thing you can do with the source configuration types is you can import those versions automatically. So this will cause UCD to run on a like a periodic timer. So in your system properties, you can set it up to poll for new versions automatically, and it will check if the version has changed from the one that you've already downloaded to CodeStation. And if it has, it will import that into a new version. So now that I've imported my new version, I can show you the process that's going to use that. So this run dynamic scan with file process. So the first part you're going to want to do is you're going to want to download that file from CodeStation. So we're just going to use the download artifacts step, and I'm just using this syntax to download everything. This is the default value for this step. So it's going to download everything from your version in CodeStation. And that's all we'll need for that. And then once I download everything, I'm free to use the scan file. So all of the other settings here are the same as we ran before without the scan template, except for this scan template file. And for this, I've created a component property. So you know how I like to use UCD properties to reference everything. So I've created a component property for AppScan on Cloud's scan file. And that's just going to be the path to that scan file, which is going to be in the agent's working directory. So I can show you the property there. So if we go back into the Altor Mutual scanner, the configuration. So we have this AppScan on Cloud scan file. And this property is actually coming from the component template. So I went ahead and created a component property in the component template so that when I make a new component using that template, it makes me specify a scan file name. So, and it's going to be treated as a component property since that's how I designed it in the component template. So now I'm just going to run this scan with using a file. So we'll go into the application, and I've already set up a new application process. So if we look into the application processes, I have run dynamic scan with file. And this is a bit different from run dynamic scan without a file because we're using a deployment type component process. So the difference with that is you're going to use the install component application step rather than just dragging over the component name and having it show you this list of operational type component processes. So we don't have an operational type component process, so we use the install components step and reference the run with file process here. So when I go through and start to run in my dev environment, I'll run this application process. It's going to prompt me for a version. So I'll select the latest, and this is, if you notice, it's going to be version 2. That's the version I just imported before. So that's going to have the very latest scan template file. And you should note that while I'm using the file system source configuration type, you could use any source configuration type you wanted. So I could essentially pull that scan file from GitHub or from a Maven repository or wherever I see fit. So, but just in this demonstration, I've just created the file in my file system. So I'll go through and run the scan with file. And it's going to be creating that presence since I still added this check. So you'll notice one difference though when I run it here is that it's not going to create the presence, it's just going to start it because I have that check. If the resource property is set, as I showed you earlier, it's just going to start the presence. And once it finishes starting it, it will run the dynamic scan with the file. And we'll just wait for that to happen. So now our scan is completed. We've started our presence, and then we also ran the scan. And you'll see that the scan template file has been downloaded properly. Afterwards, the scan template file is used to run the scan. And again, we've failed validation because both the high, medium, and low thresholds have been exceeded. So now the very last thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to show a static scan. So I have created a separate component for this called Simple IoT Java Scanner. So first, if we look at the configuration for this, this time I'm actually using the get source configuration type, and that's because I've created this Java project in GitHub that I'm just going to pull down everything from the project. And one cool thing you can do with the get source config plugin is you can actually watch for version tags. So if I look at this is my Simple IoT Java project, I can see that I have 3 different releases in here: version 1, version 2, and version 3. And these all have their own version tags. So when I go through, and I'm going to include everything in the repository. So when I go through and I run a version import, and I set that watch for tags checkbox, it's going to actually import just based on that version tag. And you'll notice that I only have version 2 imported last. So if I run a new import and don't specify any tags or anything, just let it find it on its own. It found the version 3 tag, and this is going to have all the changes associated with version 3 release. So my version 3 release has all of the different Java files, and then most importantly for the scan, all of the different class files in the bin directory. So this is what we're going to be using to run the scan. So if we look at the process that I set up for this, this is the scan static project. So first what it's going to do, it's going to download everything that I just showed you in that version 3 or version 2 or version 1, whichever one you want to deploy, into the agent's working directory. So it's going to download that full bin directory that I'm going to run the scan on and everything else in there into the agent's working directory. So after it does that, then this is the application security on cloud step to run a static scan. So again, we'll specify that application ID, login credentials, and then this scan directory. So this was what I was explaining before. This is going to be all of the different files that need to be scanned. So I just want to scan all those class files which are in the bin directory. And I can just specify bin because since I downloaded everything from CodeStation into the working directory, bin is just going to be right in the agent's working directory. Again, with static scans, you could use a scan configuration file. I'm not going to for this example. And then this static analyzer client tool location. So this is what's going to be used to generate the IRX file. You can actually either, for this field, you can specify a direct path to that IRX file. You could even just download the IRX file, use it into CodeStation, and then from CodeStation download it to the agent's working directory. But for me, I'm going to let the client tool generate the IRX file for me. So I've created an environment variable which points to the path to the static analyzer client tool. And then also we have the same fail condition threshold that we used before for the other scan types, and that's common across all the scans. Again, we can run rescans with the original scan ID, enable email notifications, and that's everything we need to set up. So we'll go through and let me save this. We'll go through the application that I've set up here, so the Simple IoT Java. And as I mentioned in the environment, so in this dev environment, I have a property set to actually point to that static analyzer tool. So this is what's going to be used to generate the IRX file at runtime. And here's the application process we're going to run. This just run static scan. It's very simple. It's just going to, and since it's the deployment process, we're using this install component step. So that's going to use the version I specify from CodeStation, and it's just going to run the scan static project component process from the simple IoT Java scanner component. So we'll go through and run this in our environment. Run static scan. We'll choose the latest version that I just imported, which will be version 3. Submit the scan. And for this one, I'm not going to use a presence file. This is just a simple example to show you how to run a static scan. So it downloaded everything from the GitHub repo. Well, everything I pulled into CodeStation from the GitHub repo. And then it will start the scan. So we'll just wait for this to finish. So now we've finished the static scan. And we'll just look at the results here. So it processed all of these class files that I specified in the bin directory. And then this scan failed validation because we had 3 high severity issues. And that exceeds the threshold of 0 high severity issues. So our step has failed. So that concludes everything that I wanted to show off with the application security on cloud plugin for urbanCode deploy. You'll note so this demonstration may have seemed a little bit more complicated, but I wanted to show off all the capabilities around parameters and property hierarchies that urbanCode has to offer, along with the source configs and everything else. But if you wanted to just run a simple scan, for instance, I wanted to run a simple app scan on cloud static scan, I could go in and just specify everything hard-coded in here. If I want to just specify application ID, login ID, everything else, I want to specify an exact directory to my to the bin directory. I could do that. I don't need to download anything from CodeStation. I could just use it. This is referencing straight on the file system. Same with the static analyzer tool. I reference it straight on my agent's file system. And everything there. And the scan would run exactly the same way. So keeping that in mind, just running simple one-off processes, while urbanCode does allow you to do that, just creating generic processes as I showed you here, you kind of lose a lot of the functionality and the benefits that you get by using urbanCode deploy. So such as the applications that I had here, I have managing all my different applications from app security right in urbanCode deploy. In each of the different applications have their own parameters. So if I had a different web application besides Altoro Mutual, I could come in here and create a new one and just set these properties and run the exact same process to run the deployment, the component process that I showed you, and it will just reference the different parameters. So that makes it very useful to be able to manage all of your applications from urbanCode. And this includes the components too. So the Altoro Mutual scanner, I actually created that from a component template. So this app security on cloud dynamic scanner component, say I wanted to create a brand new my new app scanner, for instance, and say I had even more component properties here. So I specified this one component property in my template that needs to be specified. And I just have a new scan file. So it's just useful to have that configuration for all your different components. And you don't have to manually specify every time you run a process all of your different parameters. So that's basically everything I wanted to show you in this demonstration. I hope you got a lot out of it, and I hope it helps you understand the uses of the application security on cloud plugin for urbanCode deploy. Thank you.